What price would you pay for everything you've ever wanted? Elena Rodriguez thought she knew the answer until she held 2,000 years of Roman gold in her palm and discovered that some treasures cost more than money. They cost the very thing that makes wealth worth having. Elena Rodriguez traced the rim of her coffee cup with her fingertip, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing during her morning ritual at Cafe Benedetto. The familiar weight of her grandmother's silver ring caught the light streaming through the window, and for a moment she was transported back to Mexico City, to Saturday mornings spent sorting through Abuela Carmen's collection of old coins, while the scent of Café de Olla filled the tiny kitchen. The numismatic journal lay open before her, its pages filled with auction announcements that made her chest tighten with a familiar mixture of longing and resignation. At 34, Elena had built a respectable career authenticating ancient coins, but respectability, she had learned, paid neither the rent nor her parents' mounting medical bills. Her small shop in Boston's antique district felt increasingly like a beautiful prison, filled with treasures she could catalogue but never afford to own. Her phone buzzed against the marble table. A text from her mother. "Mija, the doctor says Papa needs the surgery soon. Don't worry about us." But Elena could read between the lines, could hear her mother's careful voice trying to spare her daughter the weight of their financial burden. She closed the journal and stared out at the October morning, watching successful people hurry past in expensive coats, their confidence worn like armor against the world's uncertainties. The Whitmore Estate auction catalogue had arrived yesterday, thick with promises and provocatively understated descriptions. Elena had circled 3 lots with her red pen, knowing she could afford perhaps one if she depleted her emergency fund entirely. The coffee had grown cold in her cup, but she barely noticed, lost in calculations that never seemed to add up to enough. Page 47 of the catalogue held her attention like a magnet. Lot 247, Roman aureus, circa 64 AD. The photograph was disappointingly small, but Eleanor's trained eye caught details that made her pulse quicken. The wear patterns were wrong for a circulation coin, and the inscription seemed to carry symbols she recognized from her graduate thesis on funeral. Coins, those golden tokens placed with the dead to pay. Charon for passage to the afterlife. She spread her research books across her desk, the familiar ritual of investigation, providing comfort against the morning's financial anxieties. Her grandmother's magnifying glass, inherited along with the silver ring, revealed details that the catalogue's brief description had missed entirely. This wasn't just any aureus. The iconography suggested it had been minted for ceremonial purposes, possibly for a wealthy merchant's burial. The thought of owning such a piece sent electricity through her fingers. She imagined the weight of nearly 2,000-year-old gold in her palm, the tangible connection to ancient Rome that had first drawn her to numismatics during her undergraduate years. Dr. Patterson, her mentor, had once told her that the greatest discoveries often came disguised as ordinary lots in estate sales, overlooked by dealers seeking only obvious value. Elena calculated and recalculated her finances. The estimated value was modest, $500 to $800, well within reach if she was careful with her bidding. She touched her grandmother's ring, a talisman that had accompanied her through graduate school, her first job, the opening of her shop. Carmen had always said that sometimes the universe presented opportunities disguised as coincidences, and those brave enough to recognize them would find their fortunes changed forever. As afternoon light slanted through her shop windows, Elena made her decision. She would attend the Whitmore auction on Friday, armed with research and cautious optimism. The coin called to her with a pull she couldn't quite explain, as if it had been waiting decades for her to find it. The Whitmore auction house carried the scent of old money and older secrets. Elena sat in the back row, her bidding paddle resting against her knees, like a weapon she wasn't entirely sure how to wield. Around her, seasoned collectors examined their catalogues with the casual confidence of people for whom $1,000 purchases were mere diversions. She had dressed carefully for this moment. Her best blazer, her grandmother's ring polished to catch the light, her hair pulled back in the severe style she wore when she needed to project authority. But beneath the professional facade, her heart hammered against her ribs as Lot 247 approached. When the auctioneer's voice filled the room with clinical descriptions of provenance and condition, Elena felt herself entering a different state of consciousness. The coin appeared on the display screen, larger than life and somehow more beautiful than she had imagined. The gold held an inner fire that spoke of ancient craftsmen and imperial power, of hands long turned to dust that had once treasured this small miracle of art and metallurgy. Lot 247, Roman aureus, opening bid $500. Elena's paddle rose as if lifted by invisible strings. Around her, she was dimly aware of other bidders, but her focus had narrowed to this single moment of possibility. 600. 700. Her savings account balance flashed before her eyes, a digital countdown to financial recklessness or opportunity seized. At $850, something extraordinary happened. The other serious bidder, a distinguished man in a Savile Row suit, suddenly checked his phone, his face darkening with what looked like panic. He gathered his things and hurried from the room, leaving Elena alone in her desire. Sold to bidder 42 for $850. The gavel's fall felt like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The coin lay in Elena's palm like a small sun, heavier than its size suggested and warm in a way that seemed to transcend the autumn chill. In the privacy of her apartment, she examined her purchase with the careful attention of a scholar and the wonder of a child. The gold seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and she found herself tracing the worn Latin inscription with her fingertip, connecting across centuries with the artisan who had shaped this masterpiece. Her research took on new urgency now that she owned the coin rather than merely studied it. She discovered that the symbols matched those found on funeral coins from Nero's reign, specifically those commissioned for wealthy merchants who had died under mysterious circumstances. The historical record was frustratingly incomplete, but she found references to a Marcus Aurelius Crassus, a grain trader whose fortune had vanished shortly before his death. That evening, as Elena photographed the coin for her professional documentation, her phone rang with unexpected frequency. Dr. Patterson called with news of a consulting opportunity at the Museum of Fine Arts. A documentary producer in Los Angeles had somehow obtained her contact information and wanted to discuss featuring her expertise in an upcoming series about ancient Rome. A collector in Chicago mentioned her name in connection with a significant authentication project. Elena told herself it was coincidence, the natural result of her reputation in the small world of numismatics. But as she placed the coin carefully in her safe, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in her life's trajectory. She fell asleep that night with golden light dancing behind her eyelids, and for the first time in months, her dreams were free from financial anxiety. The consulting fees began flowing within days, each opportunity more lucrative than the last. Elena found herself working late into the evenings, her expertise suddenly in demand by clients who seemed to materialize from nowhere. She was able to wire money to her parents for her father's surgery, and the relief in her mother's voice brought tears to her eyes. Success, Elena discovered, was a master that demanded constant attention. Her days blurred together in a cascade of authentication requests, consulting calls, and media interviews. The modest apartment that had once felt cozy now seemed cramped, inadequate for someone whose professional reputation was growing so rapidly. She began looking at larger spaces, imagining a home office worthy of her expanding clientele. Maria Santos, her shop assistant for 3 years, began showing signs of strain that Elena initially attributed to the increased workload. Maria had been like a second grandmother to Elena, sharing stories of her own family while helping manage the shop's daily operations. But lately, Maria seemed distant, distracted by phone calls about her grandson's medical bills and her pension fund's unexpected troubles. The insurance company says it was a clerical error. Maria explained during one of their morning coffee breaks, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. 40 years of contributions, and they claim there's no record. My lawyer says it could take years to resolve. Elena immediately offered to increase Maria's salary to help cover the legal expenses, but Maria's pride made her refuse with the gracious stubbornness that Elena had come to love. What troubled Elena most was the change in Maria's eyes, a dimming that reminded her of photographs where the subject seems to be looking through the camera rather than at it. Dr. Patterson's call came on a Wednesday evening as Elena was cataloguing a new acquisition. His voice carried a weight she had never heard before, aged beyond his 72 years. His extensive coin collection, built over 4 decades of careful curation, had been destroyed in a burst pipe that the insurance company was calling an act of nature. 30 years of accumulated knowledge and passion, reduced to water-damaged metal and ruined documentation. Elena found herself making the same offer she had made to Maria. Money, assistance, whatever resources she could provide. But like Maria, Dr. Patterson declined with quiet dignity that somehow made his loss more heartbreaking. As she hung up the phone, Elena looked at the coin resting on her desk, its golden surface seeming to shimmer with satisfaction. The third incident involved Elena's brother, Carlos, whose small restaurant in Phoenix had been his pride and joy for nearly a decade. The business partner who had embezzled their savings was someone Carlos had trusted like family, a betrayal that cut deeper than mere financial loss. When Carlos called to tell her the news, his voice carried a hollowness that reminded Elena painfully of both Maria and Dr. Patterson. Elena sat in her expanded office. She had moved to a larger space in Back Bay, surrounded by the artifacts and documents that represented her growing success. But for the first time since acquiring the coin, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. She pulled out a legal pad and began making a list, documenting the dates and details of each tragedy that had befallen people close to her. The pattern that emerged made her hands shake. Maria's pension crisis had begun exactly 1 week after Eleanor's first major consulting contract. Dr. Patterson's flood had occurred on the same day she signed with the documentary producers. Carlos's betrayal had been discovered within hours of her largest authentication fee being deposited. Her rational mind rejected what the evidence suggested. Correlation was not causation, she reminded herself, echoing her graduate statistics professor. But the scientist in her could not ignore the mathematical precision of the timing. The way each personal triumph had been shadowed by someone else's disaster. Elena found herself returning to her research on the coin's history, digging deeper into archives and historical records than she had ever gone before. She discovered references to Marcus Aurelius Crassus's business practices, hints of ruthless competition and questionable ethics that had made him wealthy at the expense of his rivals. The records suggested that his death had been celebrated by many who had suffered financial ruin due to his machinations. That night, Elena held the coin up to the lamplight, studying its ancient surface for answers that gold could not provide. The weight of it in her palm felt different now, not just the heft of precious metal, but something heavier, more complex. She thought of her grandmother Carmen, who had always insisted that objects could carry the memories and intentions of their previous owners, that some treasures came with prices that weren't immediately apparent. Elena's reflection in her new apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows showed a woman she was still learning to recognize. The stress lines around her eyes had softened, replaced by the confident bearing of someone whose financial security was no longer in question. Her wardrobe had evolved to match her rising status. and she could afford to have her hair styled at the salon her wealthier clients frequented. But wealth, she was discovering, could be as isolating as poverty, just with better furniture. Her old friends from graduate school seemed uncomfortable around her now, their conversations carefully avoiding topics related to money or career advancement. When she offered to pick up dinner checks or suggested expensive restaurants, she could see them withdrawing into politeness that felt more distant than anger would have been. Sofia Restrepo, her closest friend since their doctoral program, had been the most direct about the changes she observed. "You're different, Elena," she had said during their last lunch together. "It's not just the money. There's something in your eyes that wasn't there before, something that makes me feel cold." Elena had tried to laugh off Sofia's concerns, but the words had lodged themselves in her chest like splinters. That evening, she had called her parents in Mexico City, needing to hear voices that had loved her long before she could afford to solve their problems with money transfers. Her father, recovered from his surgery and eternally grateful, spoke of returning to work soon. Her mother shared neighborhood gossip and recipes with the same warmth that had sustained Elena through her childhood. But even in those conversations, Elena detected something new, a careful distance that hadn't existed before. They spoke to her now as benefactor as much as daughter, and she realized that her ability to solve their financial problems had somehow altered the fundamental dynamics of their relationship. Love remained, but it was now complicated by gratitude and obligation in ways that made spontaneous affection more difficult. The coin sat on her desk as she worked, its presence both comforting and troubling. Sometimes in her peripheral vision she could swear it moved slightly, catching light in ways that seemed intentional. But when she looked directly at it, it remained as static as any ancient artifact should be, beautiful and mysterious and utterly still. Elena's reputation in the numismatic world had grown beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. Museums sought her authentication services, collectors paid premium fees for her expertise, and academic conferences invited her as a keynote speaker. She had achieved the professional recognition that had been her dream since graduate school. But the accomplishment felt strangely hollow. The irony was not lost on her that her expertise in ancient currencies had finally brought her modern financial security, but at a cost she was only beginning to calculate. Each new client, each lucrative contract seemed to coincide with another friend or colleague facing financial hardship. The pattern had become so pronounced that Elena found herself hesitating before accepting new work, afraid of what disasters might follow her success. Dr. Patterson had been forced to sell his house and move into a modest apartment, his life's work reduced to a few salvaged pieces and decades of memories. When Elena visited him in his new home, she was struck by how small he seemed, surrounded by plain furniture and bare walls. He still smiled when he saw her, still asked about her work with genuine interest. But something essential had been diminished. "I've been thinking about that aureus of yours," he said during her visit, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea that was probably more luxury than necessity in his current circumstances. The historical record on Marcus Aurelius Crassus is more extensive than most people realize. He was known for a particular business practice. He would identify promising enterprises and find ways to undermine them, then acquire their assets at bankruptcy prices. Elena felt her pulse quicken, but Dr. Patterson continued before she could respond. "What's interesting is that after his death, several of his rivals experienced mysterious reversals of fortune. Businesses failed, investments collapsed, families lost their wealth in ways that seemed orchestrated. The ancient historians attributed it to the gods' justice, but modern scholars might call it the long arm of consequence." As Elena drove home that evening, Dr. Patterson's words echoed in her mind. She thought about Marcus Aurelius Crassus, about the coin that had supposedly accompanied him to his grave, about the strange mathematics of her recent success. For the first time since the auction, she considered the possibility that some prices were too high to pay. Regardless of what they purchased, The antique mirror in Elena's new apartment reflected not just her image, but the accumulated symbols of her transformation. Behind her, the coin rested on a museum-quality display stand, surrounded by certificates of authentication and photographs documenting its historical significance. The room itself had become a monument to success. Expensive furniture, original artwork, shelves lined with rare books and scholarly awards. But mirrors, Elena had learned, could be ruthlessly honest about things their owners preferred not to see. The woman looking back at her had gained material security at the cost of something less tangible, but equally valuable. Her grandmother's ring still adorned her finger, but it seemed smaller now, overshadowed by the designer watch and elegant jewelry that marked her elevated status. She had been avoiding Sophia's calls for 2 weeks, unable to face another conversation about her transformation. Maria had finally accepted early retirement, her financial situation too precarious to continue working for Elena's shop, which now operated more as a high-end consulting firm than a neighborhood antique store. The physical space felt like a mausoleum, beautiful and cold, and somehow empty despite being filled with priceless artifacts. Elena found herself spending long evenings researching not just the coin's historical significance, but its personal cost. She documented each coincidence, each tragedy that had followed her rising fortune, building a case file that would have impressed the forensic accountants she now employed to manage her investments. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming, a pattern that defied statistical probability. The revelation came to her during a late-night research session when exhaustion had worn away her rational defenses. She was reading about Crassus's business methods when she realized that she had begun unconsciously mimicking his strategies. Her consulting clients often faced unexpected difficulties that led them to rely more heavily on her services. Competitors found themselves struggling with problems that elevated Elena's reputation by comparison. She had become complicit in her own isolation, using her success to insulate herself from the very relationships that had once given her life meaning. The coin had not cursed her, it had simply revealed the person she was capable of becoming. When wealth became more important than connection, Elena's mother's voice, across the international phone connection, carried undertones of worry that transcended language barriers. "Mija, you sound tired. Are you taking care of yourself?" The concern was genuine, but Elena could hear the careful distance that had grown between them since she had begun solving their problems with money instead of presence. "I'm fine. Mama, just working a lot." But the words felt hollow, a performance of wellness that fooled neither of them. Elena found herself staring at the coin while they talked, its golden surface reflecting the light from her expensive lamps. She had everything she had thought she wanted, but the conversation felt like speaking across a chasm that widened with each deposited check she sent home. After hanging up, Elena sat in the silence of her apartment, surrounded by beautiful things that felt increasingly like expensive barriers between herself and the world. She thought about her grandmother Carmen, who had died with very little money but had been mourned by an entire neighborhood. The funeral had been standing room only, filled with people whose lives had been touched by Carmen's generosity, of spirit rather than her bank account. The comparison stung because Elena realized she could not imagine her own funeral being attended by anyone other than professional colleagues and business associates. The people who had once loved her unconditionally had been pushed away by her success, not maliciously, but through the inevitable physics of changed circumstances and altered priorities. She opened her laptop and began drafting an email to Sophia, then deleted it. Started a text to Dr. Patterson, then erased it. Considered calling Carlos, then put her phone aside. Each attempt at reconnection felt artificial, contaminated by the awareness that she had gained the power to solve their problems, but had lost the ability to simply share their lives. The coin seemed to pulse with warmth in the lamplight. And Elena found herself wondering if Marcus Aurelius Crassus had faced similar moments of recognition. Had there been a night when he had looked around his mansion and realized that wealth had purchased everything except the things that mattered most? Had he died lonely, surrounded by gold but abandoned by love? Elena's decision crystallized during a routine morning that felt anything but ordinary. She was preparing her usual coffee when she realized she had unconsciously begun performing her grandmother's ritual. 3 spoonfuls of sugar, stirred counterclockwise while thinking of the people she loved. But as she tried to summon those faces, she found her mental catalogue disturbingly sparse. The recognition hit her with the force of revelation. She had gained the whole world and lost her soul, just as her childhood Sunday school teacher had warned. But unlike biblical parables, her situation was not hopeless. The coin might have revealed her capacity for spiritual poverty, but it had not made that poverty inevitable. She called Sophia first, expecting to reach voicemail, but finding her friend's voice live and cautious on the other end. "Elena, is everything all right?" The question carried months of accumulated concern and distance, but also hope that something might be repairable. "I need to tell you something," Elena said, her voice catching with emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. "You were right about me changing, and I think I know why." The conversation that followed was the most honest Elena had engaged in since acquiring the coin. She told Sophia about the pattern of coincidences, about her growing isolation, about the way success had gradually poisoned the relationships that had once sustained her. Sophia listened without judgment, asking questions that helped Elena articulate feelings she had been avoiding. "The coin isn't cursed," Elena finally said, the words emerging like a confession. "I think I am, or was. I'd let it change me into someone I don't recognize." Sophia's response surprised her, then changed back. "You're not a Roman merchant from 2,000 years ago, Elena. You get to choose who you become." That afternoon, Elena called Dr. Patterson and invited him to dinner at her apartment. She prepared her grandmother's recipe for mole poblano, working with ingredients that required hours of patient preparation. The physical act of cooking felt like meditation, each step connecting her to memories of family kitchens and shared meals where conversation mattered more than career advancement. Dr. Patterson arrived, bearing a small gift, a photocopy of additional research he had conducted about Marcus Aurelius Crassus. Over dinner, they discussed not just the historical significance of the coin, but its personal impact on Elena's life. The older scholar listened with the patience of someone who had spent decades helping students navigate the space between academic achievement and human fulfillment. "The most dangerous artifacts," he said as they shared Elena's homemade flan, "are the ones that show us possibilities we didn't know we possessed." "Your coin didn't make you wealthy, Elena. It revealed that you had the capacity for wealth. But it also revealed that you had the capacity for isolation. The question is, which capacity you choose to develop." Elena nodded, understanding spreading through her like warmth. "I think I need to give it back." "To whom?" "To someone who can appreciate its historical significance without being consumed by its personal cost." They spent the evening researching museums and institutions that might provide the coin with an appropriate home. Dr. Patterson suggested the Museum of Fine Arts, where it could be displayed as part of their Roman collection and studied by future scholars. Elena felt a weight lifting from her chest as they made the arrangements, as if she were exhaling breath she had been holding for months. The donation process took several weeks to complete, but Elena found herself feeling lighter with each piece of paperwork filed. She used the time to reach out to other relationships that had suffered during her period of transformation. Maria accepted an invitation to lunch, and they spent an afternoon reminiscing about the early days of Elena's shop, when passion had mattered more than profit. Carlos called from Phoenix with news that he had found investors to help him restart his restaurant. His voice carried hope that Elena had not heard since before the embezzlement, and she realized that her brother's resilience had never depended on her ability to solve his problems. He had needed her support, not her money, and she had confused the two. The day Elena delivered the coin to the Museum of Fine Arts, autumn had settled over Boston with the crisp clarity that made the city feel like a place where important decisions were made and honored. She carried the artifact in its museum-quality case, accompanied by comprehensive documentation of its provenance and significance. Dr. Sarah Chen, the museum's chief curator of ancient artifacts, examined the coin with the reverence Elena remembered feeling during her own first encounter with it. But Dr. Chen's appreciation was purely scholarly, uncontaminated by personal ambition or financial need. Elena felt a profound relief watching someone else hold the aureus, knowing that its power to reveal human weakness would now be contained within academic context. "This will be the centerpiece of our Roman exhibition," Dr. Chen said, already envisioning the educational programs and scholarly papers the coin would inspire. "The documentation you've provided is extraordinary. This will advance understanding of funeral coins and Neronian-era minting practices significantly." As Elena signed the final donation papers, she thought about Marcus Aurelius Crassus and wondered if he had ever imagined his funeral coin ending up in a climate-controlled display case 2,000 years after his death. The irony was perfect, a symbol of individual greed transformed into a tool for collective learning. Walking home through the public garden, Elena felt the absence of the coin's weight, like phantom limb syndrome, present but no longer troublesome. Her grandmother's ring caught the afternoon light, and she realized it had always been more valuable than the aureus because it carried love rather than mere gold. That evening, she called her parents and had the first conversation in months that felt entirely natural. They talked about her father's recovery, her mother's garden, neighborhood gossip that had nothing to do with Elena's career or financial status. When she hung up the phone, she was crying, but the tears felt like rain after drought, cleansing and necessary and completely healing. 6 months after donating the coin, Elena had restructured her life around principles that her grandmother would have recognized. Her consulting practice remained successful, but she had learned to choose clients based on the intrinsic interest of their projects rather than their fees. She had moved to a smaller apartment that felt like home rather than a museum, and she had rehired Maria to help manage the human side of her business. The antique shop had been transformed into a combination workspace and teaching studio, where Elena offered authentication services alongside educational workshops for young numismatists. Dr. Patterson served as a guest lecturer, sharing 4 decades of accumulated wisdom with students who reminded Elena of her younger self, passionate about history and hungry for mentorship that valued learning over earning. Sophia had become a regular dinner companion again, and their conversations carried the easy intimacy of a friendship that had survived testing. Elena had learned to ask about Sophia's work and worries without immediately offering solutions that money could buy. Sometimes the most valuable thing she could provide was attention rather than assistance. The letter from the Museum of Fine Arts arrived on a Thursday morning, informing Elena that the Marcus Aurelius Crassus aureus had become one of their most popular exhibits. Dr. Chen reported that school groups were particularly fascinated by the coin's story, and several students had been inspired to pursue classical studies as a result of seeing it. The artifact that had once isolated Elena was now connecting dozens of young minds to ancient history. Elena smiled as she read the letter, then tucked it into the same drawer where she kept her grandmother's recipes and her parents' occasional handwritten notes. Some treasures, she had learned, were worth preserving, not because they were rare or valuable, but because they connected the present to what mattered most about the past. As afternoon light slanted through her shop windows, Elena looked up from the coin she was authenticating, a simple denarius from the reign of Augustus, beautiful in its ordinariness. Her grandmother's ring caught the light, and Elena touched it with the familiar gesture that had accompanied her morning coffee ritual for as long as she could remember. Outside, Boston continued its eternal dance of ambition and achievement, but Elena had found her place within it, successful enough to matter, connected enough to belong, wise enough to know the difference between wealth and richness. The weight of gold had taught her to value the weight of love, and in learning that lesson, she had found something more precious than any ancient coin could ever be. If this story touched something deep within you, subscribe to Mr. Blackwood Stories. Ring that bell. You wouldn't want to miss what shadows I'll explore next. Comment below, what price have you paid for success? Your confessions fuel these tales. Until next time, may your fortunes be earned, not taken.